Keir Starmer suspending 7 Labour MPs from the parliamentary party in one go is a pretty bold move. So you'd think the Prime Minister would be keen to have a minister explain to the electorate why he took such drastic action. Well, think again.
Now, we normally would have had an interview with a government minister by now. And in fact, I was prepping, the team were helping me prep for Yvette Cooper, MP for Pontefract.
Yeah, indeed, and we're trying to get to the reason why Yvette Cooper, Home Secretary, is not here.
What do you make of the Home Secretary running for the hills this morning and not wanting to explain to us why 7 MPs have had the whip removed from them for now?
Well, exactly as you guys were discussing earlier, I think it seems on given the news flow, and they've given you no explanation, that is exactly what's happening, running for the hills. And I don't think that sends out a particularly strong message. And it's also, as we know, better than most in this business and the breakfast show, it leaves you hanging without much else to do instead. So it's rather disrespectful on top of that. And again, 3 weeks into the new government, if you're sending a message loud and clear to your own MPs by suspending the whip, you've got to back that message up the following day.
Obviously, a very serious issue, but it was quite entertaining, I thought, actually, to see those Sky Hosts say the real crime here is we've now got nothing to talk about for 10 minutes because we hadn't prepared to have this gap in the show. No government minister has gone on air to back up Starmer's suspensions so far, I think, on any of the channels. Instead, we got Has-Been speaking to Radio 4 today. Former MP Jonathan Ashworth defended Starmer's decision.
The removal of the whip is meant to be a more of a new, and has been historically, could be changing. And that's what I'm trying to monitor here. What's regular, what's normal, and what we're to see of this government moving forward if we get to know it. It's meant to be more of a nuclear option.
But these decisions are made in a particular context. And the context we're in at the moment is 3 weeks or so since a general election when the first King's speech, the first Labour King's speech was put forward, based on a manifesto that was put to the British people and endorsed by the British people in that general election. And to not defend the King's speech in the voting lobbies, the first Labour King's speech for 14 years, is why this decision has been taken. Whipping decisions are taken in the context, and that is the context of this whipping decision.
So you think this isn't anything to be criticised? It's not a new way of doing politics, and it's not something that it should concern anyone?
I don't think any of us should be surprised.
Now, Ashworth is simply wrong about this. This was a surprising move, possibly indicating a new and much harsher approach to whipping in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Previous Labour governments have faced down much larger and more significant rebellions without suspending anyone. In 1997, Tony Blair faced a revolt when 47 Labour MPs voted against a bill to cut benefits for single-parent families. Just 6 months into his first government, no one lost the whip. 6 years later, 121 MPs revolted over the Iraq War. Again, no one lost the whip. Now, neither of those were rebellions against a king's or queen's speech, but there are precedents there too. In 2004, 3 Labour MPs voted in favour of a Lib Dem amendment to Labour's legislative agenda, calling for checks on the government's power to take us to war. None of them lost the whip. And in 1945, Clement Attlee's King's Speech faced a rebellion by 45 Labour MPs who voted to amend one of the most socially transformative legislative agendas in British history. None of them were suspended either. In fact, the only real precedent for Starmer's actions appears to be those of a recent Tory leader. In 2019, Boris Johnson withdrew the whip from 21 Tory MPs for rebelling over Brexit, blocking many of them from standing in the election later that year. So I think we can safely say this is a new and more authoritarian move from Starmer's Labour Party. Yet some Labour figures are insisting on defending it. This was Emily Thornberry on Politics Live.
What does it say about Keir Starmer's leadership, just pretty well a week in since Parliament's returned, about suspending these 7 MPs?
Let me just start by saying nobody in the Labour Party likes the 2-child benefit cap. I mean, we really don't. I was one of 3 children, and we were brought up on benefits. My parents had their children before before my father left, so my mother had no idea she was going to have a 3rd child in poverty. Yeah, I don't want there to be a 2-child cap. I absolutely don't. I'm Labour. It comes from my heart. I don't want this. But we have just had a general election where we have been completely clear that there is a we have the highest taxation levels that we've ever had. We have a huge debt burden, and any spending that we're going to, we have to show where the money comes from. We were absolutely clear during a general election that we had this specific debate. I remember in the clause 5.
So those 7 MPs shouldn't have rebelled.
So we've just had a general election. There was a clear platform, and then within 2 weeks, is it 2 weeks we've been in government? They're voting against the King's Speech, the first speech where Labour is setting out its platform, and they decide that although they've just been elected on that platform, they're going to rebel. So we've got lots and lots of new MPs. It has to be clear what the rules are, and I think the Whips are putting down a marker.
It's a little bit sad, that really. Emily Thornberry has obviously shown a lot of loyalty to Keir Starmer over the past few months. She went on air and defended his statement that it was perfectly reasonable and within international law for Israel to cut off food and water to Gaza. She then was left out of his government. So she was Shadow Attorney General for a very long time. They enter government. She's on the backbenches. Still, though, she's out to defend Keir Starmer. I think she wants to be chair of a select committee, so maybe this is to get brownie points for that. Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham has also jumped to Starmer's defence. Interestingly, he himself was a victim of a Labour whipping operation in 2015. The real thing that scuppered his leadership ambitions was a vote whipped by the Labour leadership that they should abstain on the benefit cap, which became completely totemic. So we'll have to wait and see if this vote becomes as totemic as that one did. Helena, what have you made of sort of the media commentary and Labour's defences of suspending these 7 MPs?
Amusingly, I actually called into LBC to speak to Jonathan Ashworth about this very issue. I don't think that when we spoke, his defence of the actions of Starmer and his administration were in any way a good defence of what they did, but you'll have to listen to that yourself. But what I think it really does show, one thing it definitely shows is, remember 2 years ago, over the last 2 years, there's a lot of discussion over the authoritarianism they were engaging in terms of how they selected candidates for this election. And of course, really and truly, the metric they were using for getting rid of some candidates from shortlists was that they wanted to ensure that they had party loyalty, 100% loyalty to their leadership from anyone that was selected. There are plenty of people who were given positions to be able to be MPs during the last round of selections who were significantly to the left of the current Labour leadership on policy. People like Miatta Fahnbulleh or Jeevan Sander from the New Economics Foundation are definitely more economically left-wing than anything that Pat McFadden would allow to be Labour Party policy. But they've been allowed to be put in essentially because they are loyal to the leadership. That was the metric, because they didn't want these things to happen. It's not what any leader really wants to happen, is to have to deal with rebellions and then to continue that authoritarianism through to then make the entire talk of the media being whether or not this was the right thing to do, rather than discussing the enormous mandate they have to put through this King's Speech, for example. Because really and truly, it doesn't make any sense to me. You have a giant majority, a tiny handful rebel over it. Who cares? Blair certainly didn't care. He knew that the left was essentially completely neutered by his huge majority and the Blair's babes who'd been elected at the time. So he didn't need to do this performative flagellation game of the left wing of the party, which shows you really just kind of like spiteful and kind of pathetic the kind of Labour leadership are over these issues. But it also signals as well, it was deliberately being done on this issue to signal this idea of the changed Labour Party. Now, when they talked about the changed Labour Party, the strategists in Keir Starmer's team, they really wanted to change the perception of the Labour Party rather than being the party of the left of politics to being the de facto governing party of the UK, something that had always kind of been the reserve of the Conservative Party. They wanted, in the wake of what happened to the Tories, to change that round, to say, no, we're the party of the British people. We're going to be the ones who are mostly in power. Sometimes we might lose, but we want to take that role away from the Conservatives. And having left-wingers in the party who are, a bit more firebrand, slightly out of step with the median voters' opinions on issues such as the two-child benefit cap, that gets in the way of whether or not that you can have this perception. It's very similar, actually, to the Australian Labour Party. Now, in the ALP, they will always remove and suspend anybody who ever votes against the government, ever, on any issue whatsoever. You have to vote with the party or you get your whip suspended. You get removed from the party completely. This just happened very recently. A senator in Australia called Fatima Payman was removed from the party from her position as sitting as a Labour senator indefinitely over one single crossing of the floor to join the Greens to vote to recognise Palestine. And that's the very kind of dictatorial way in which that they do things over there. And it's clearly something that the Labour Party here want to emulate, to be able to have this new vision of the governing party. The broad church is over. What will be interesting, though, is the media haven't touched this, but I think you touched on this with Zara slightly as well, is that what this does open them up to is a lot of electoral consequences. There are plenty of people in Labour heartland seats where they have giant safe seat majorities before 2024 that are now slightly more in favour because, of course, especially the poorest in society, the ones who really do need an increase in welfare payments and have themselves lifted out of poverty, those were all of the communities where Labour lost support at this election, sometimes drastically so. And now previous safe seats are going to be competitive seats at the next election for the Green Party. And if they are not just abandoning this policy, but performatively being draconian in terms of how they deal with internal party matters, overlooking like they are being all bad on these policies, that's going to filter through to the public to say, well, hang on a minute, if I'm from these poor communities, Labour doesn't speak for me anymore. It doesn't speak for them anymore, and they will look for alternatives, and therefore plenty of MPs could be at risk of losing their seats if this becomes a way in which that Labour will govern over the course of time. And I think Labour probably have factored that into how they are looking towards their continual time in government.
I suppose on this particular issue, I would assume that the Labour Party, because it's become so totemic, I think they probably will get rid of the cap relatively soon, potentially even sort of at the next budget. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see. But I would assume that they would then be thinking, this is not going to be a big issue at the next general election because we will have got rid of it, 3 years previously by the time we're at the next general election, or 4 years previously. And so this was an attempt to say, it's our way or the highway. We've got a plan. You get on board with the plan or you're out. I mean, I think it's incredibly authoritarian and I think it's unnecessary. I think previous prime ministers haven't done it and they didn't need to do it. And it seems bitter and vindictive. But on this particular issue, I suppose electorally, Keir Starmer probably feels sort of relatively secure because I think they do have a plan to get rid of this cap. I mean, how would you respond to that?
I mean, I think that that may be so. They may say that if they do get 2.5% growth or whatever, when they've got extra money coming into the treasury in terms of receipts because of economic growth, they may say later on, oh, well, now we've shown we can be fiscally credible, but now we'll remove the cap. But the point really is that they wouldn't have thought. I think the consequence is going to come from the action of being authoritarian to those who voted for the amendment. If they just voted for the amendment and it wasn't a big deal because they'd not made it a big deal because they were still feeling spiteful of what happened to Andy Burnham in 2015 potentially, then it would have the amendment would have failed. Nobody would have paid attention. It would have completely forgotten, and then they can move on to 6, 12, 18 months' time if they do want to remove the cap. And then suddenly they can say, look, we speak for these communities again. But by essentially taking these MPs to task and making it essentially the subject matter that everybody's talking about, it's not going to be forgotten. They're going to have independent MPs sitting on the benches for 6 months. That's a long time. And that's going to be clear for everybody who watches footage in the Commons. They're going to be not around with the Labour Party anymore, which is essentially going to be a way in which that everyone will see optically that they are no longer a part of that party. It will make people think back specifically to this moment where the Labour Party thought, no, the line that we're drawing is whether or not that we lift children out of poverty or not. Like, that's the line we're going to draw over whether or not we remove the whip for things. But again, which is completely out of kilter with the way in which whip withdrawals have been done in the past. There are plenty of MPs who I think have done some pretty awful stuff on the Labour benches at the moment. I'm not going to name any names, but I think people know the kind of people I'm referring to here, who've had the whip restored to them after they've done horrendous things that really do damage the party in a way that this clearly does not do. And that's something people will remember.